Hello again. This is Angela Wade and my little gremlin Zarmina, back with chapter 11 of Cloak of Obscurity. And this one's called Something Fishy. The last thing I wanted was to spend the rest of my evening surrounded by food the temple wouldn't permit me to eat. So instead of going home to the Snake and Egg, I took to wandering the streets aimlessly, wondering how in the world I was going to tell Lee and Dolores what had happened to poor Allison. I was not looking forward to breaking their hearts all over again. I knew they would react to the news of her suicide badly. Dolores might even blame herself, as Dennis had. Still, they deserved the truth. I was just too cowardly to give it to them. When the midnight bell started ringing, I knew it was time I went home. With any luck, everyone would be so worn out from cooking and stuffed with fish that I would be able to slip upstairs unnoticed. I decided to go in the back way. I had to step carefully. The alley was paved with cats. Judging by the smell, Sadie'd been tossing unwanted fish parts out the kitchen door again. The cats were sprawled everywhere in the dark, furry mounds with fat stomachs and insufferably self-satisfied smirks. The air vibrated with purring and an occasional belch. Little mooches. The tavern was very quiet. All the patrons, except for a couple of Sadie's regular beggars who lay snoring at the far end of the hall, had gone home and the doors and shutters were closed. Most of the lamps were doused as well. On my way in, I passed Dolores, still puttering about in the kitchen. I smiled wanly at her and told her she ought to sit down, but she shrugged me off. Sadie's half-dozen staff were resting in the dining hall, in much the same condition as the cats. They all called greetings to me as I entered, but none of them got up. I figured the Snake and Egg wouldn't reopen for a day at least, because it would be that long before anyone could bear to look at food again. One of the cooks was snuggled up to Anna, pawing her affectionately. She smiled placidly and did not resist. I bit back a sigh, thinking, and there's another girl I've got no chance with. Now, Sadie and her husband sat at the central table counting coins. Sadie waved me over, grinning. "Oh, Eddie," she said, "look at all this money. Isn't it wonderful? And we've decided to give you a share of it, love, because it was your idea." "Actually," I said, "it was Lee's idea, and I'd be happy with a share of the fish." "Oh, but Eddie, we thought you'd eaten before you went out. Fish doesn't keep, so we ate everything as wasn't sold," Sadie said apologetically. Nat confirmed her statement with a tremendous gassy belch. The others echoed him with a frog chorus of lesser burps. I tried to feel superior, as my cousin Damien would have, but I failed. I'd been living on bread and tea for 5 days. Another lost opportunity. "Where's Lee?" I asked. "Over here," called a small, sleepy voice from a dark corner. I went to find her. She was curled against a wall, smiling contentedly and stroking a bulge in her apron. "So," I whispered, grinning, "what are you hiding there?" The bulge was moving. I suspected she had smuggled in a kitten from St. Phoebe's army outside. "Hiding? I'm not hiding anything." Her eyes widened, and she clasped her hands across a suspicious lump. "You've got a cat in your apron," I insisted. "You see it. Let's see it." She glanced about, then leaned towards me with a conspiratorial glint in her eyes. "Shh! It's not a cat." She reached under her apron and drew out the biggest, fattest, blackest rat I'd ever seen. I stifled a yell of alarm. "Have you lost your mind, Lee?" I said, trying to keep my voice down. What are you doing, bringing that filth in here? If Sadie found out there was a rat in her dining hall, she'd have a fatal fit. He's not filthy, Lee protested, cradling the rat to her breast. He's quite clean. I gave him a bath when we got out of prison. I sputtered. Modern world. Sorry about that. Do have to live in it. Don't necessarily have to like it, but I do have to live in it. Now, where were we? If you're quite finished out there. Have you lost your mind, Lee? I said, trying to keep my voice down. What are you doing, bringing that filth in here? If Sadie found out there was a rat in her dining hall, she'd have a fatal fit. He's not filthy, Lee protested, cradling the rat to her breast. He's quite clean. I gave him a bath when we got out of prison. I sputtered. Now you and this thing are a we? He's sweet, Lee said, stroking the rat's whiskers tenderly with one finger. All the rats in my cell would take food I put out for them, but this one would come right up and take it from my hand, and he likes me to stroke him, just like a cat or a dog. The rat sat up on his haunches in Lee's hand. He rubbed his wicked pink paws together, as if in eager anticipation of the pampering Lee was likely to lavish on him. I decided that this was one fortunate rodent. From the expression on Lee's face, I knew I'd be unlikely to separate the elf from her new pet, but I was bound to try. You've got to get rid of that thing before Sadie sees it, I said. Chuck him out the back door. Master Edward, that would be murder, Lee whispered, aghast. The alley is crawling with cats. Those cats have eaten so many fish heads. I doubt that even one of them could waddle 2 steps after a rat even if it wanted to. Besides, Lee, rats are creatures of the evil one. They steal and destroy and foul things. They bring disease and famine. They were made to plague mankind. According to your books, Lee countered, this little rat was born a helpless creature, a living thing of flesh and blood. He doesn't gnaw things to plague people. He's just trying to find food and stay alive. You told me St. Cyprian found a use for stinging bees and redeemed them. Why can't there be redemption for a rat? Before I could come up with an answer to that, Sadie called, Say, what are you two doing? Nothing, Lee cried, quickly tucking the rat back into her apron. We're debating religion, I added. So, Lee said, her dark eyes meeting mine, you won't tell? How could I? Sadie'd drop over dead if she knew. Lee winked at me. Thanks. I sat down on the floor next to her and tried not to pay attention the way she was cuddling the rat. I'm almost afraid to ask, I said. But how did things go after I left? The elf grinned. I love your family, she said. I groaned. What did they do? They didn't do anything wrong anyway. I think they're all wonderful, especially your father. My father? Yes, he's so honest. Honest? Lee laughed at me. Yes, honest. He always says exactly what he thinks, and he never seems to worry what other people think of him. You should try to be more like him. I wasn't quite sure what to say. Not that I didn't love and respect the man, but I'd spent a good part of my life trying to be less like him. So where have you been? Lee asked. I would have thought you'd be back before now. I really didn't want to ruin everyone's evening with bad news. It's a long story, Lee. I'll tell you in the morning. I spent much longer than necessary washing my face, shaving, and combing my hair the next morning. Then I went upstairs to my roof garden and dawdled over gathering herbs. Next, I went back down to my books and reread the directions for brewing my upset stomach potion. Finally, I realized I'd put it off long enough. I had to talk to Lee and Dolores. "Good morning," called Sadie across the hall as I entered the dining room. As I suspected, the door and shutters were still closed. "I've given everyone the day off. I'm too tired to keep 'em out of trouble," she yawned. She was sitting in her chair, still in the center of the room, with her broad bare feet propped on a bench. I'd never noticed before, but even her ankles were fat. "My feet are killing me. I worked so hard yesterday I was near run off them," I said, grinning. "Exactly. You need the kitchen?" she asked, nodding toward my bundle of herbs. "Yes, it's all yours. Enjoy yourself. Oh, and if you happen to cook up any of your cure for the bellyache, let me know about it. Young Dick, the new boy, seems to be feeling a bit poorly." I nodded, then hesitated. Sadie, did Dolores and Lee go home last night? Or are they still here?" "Oh, they're still here, love," she said. "Dolores is fooling around in the kitchen. Can't say what for. I don't think any of us want any breakfast. Lee's still sleeping. Dear lamb. Nat and I gave her a cot up in our room." Poor Lee, I thought. Sometimes the brewer's snoring kept me awake, and I slept down the hall with 2 closed doors between us. "Did you need to talk to them?" Sadie asked. Yes, but it can wait. You know, your family were lovely, Eddie," Sadie said. "So nice and polite." Polite? I wondered if she had the right family. "Always please and thank you, and ate up everything put before 'em as grateful as you please, and paid without being asked, even left a little extra for Anna and the lads." "Well, I'm glad they behaved themselves," I said. "Your father carried home a whole barrel of Nat's best beer," out of himself, I wondered, "in a hand cart, and he said it was the best he'd ever had, and he's going to send one of his apprentices back for more, at least once a week." "Oh, that sounds like my father," I said. "Not so pleased to meet a fella so concerned with the craftsmanship of his beer." "Well, it's true my father is very concerned with beer." "Were those all of your sisters?" "All but the one in the convent," I said. "They're all beautiful lasses." Sadie sighed. "Your folks must be right proud of you all. What a lovely family you have, Eddie." "I have to admit," I said, "I am quite fond of them." "Now, how does that cousin of yours fit in?" Sadie asked. "The one who turned up the other day after the trial?" Damien. He's my mother's brother's son." Sadie said. "He's not anything like the rest of them." Damien would probably have taken that as a compliment. "Do you know, he looks exactly like a weasel." That, on the other hand, he would have taken as it was meant. "Good morning, Master Edward," Lee called as she came into the dining room. "How are you?" "I'm fine, Lee. I hated to do this, but the longer I put it off, the worse it would hurt. Like ripping the dressing off a wound, it was better done all at once." "Lee," I said, "I have to talk to you and Dolores. It's important." She stared at me. "Master Edward, is something wrong?" It's not all bad news, but I think Dolores is in the kitchen. We should go in and talk to her." Sadie shook her head. "Lee, call her out here," she ordered. "Dolores is my kinswoman. Any ill news she needs to hear, I want to be with her." Lee scampered into the kitchen and returned with Dolores. The old housekeeper was wringing her hands in her apron. "What is it, Master Edward?" she asked. "Is Dennis going to be hanged?" "No," I said. "Dennis has been found innocent. He's been set free, and now has the unenviable task of explaining all this to his father." "But something's wrong," Dolores said, reading my expression. "It's not Malcolm, is it? He couldn't possibly have—" "No," I said with a sigh. "He didn't. Dolores, Lee, I have to tell you, I hate to do it, but..." I paused and rubbed my eyes. Allison took her own life. She threw herself from the cliffs. "What?" Dolores exclaimed. "How do you know that?" "I went to the place where she died last night," I said. "I found her ring, the one that Malcolm gave her, hanging from a bush, and I cast a spell over it, and I had a vision of how she died." They looked at me in silent horror, their eyes welling with tears. "I wanted to be sure," I continued, "that what I had seen was the truth, and I took her ring to Lord Gabriel at the castle, and he confirmed it." Dolores said, "Where is the ring now? Malcolm will want it back, I suppose." I withdrew it from my pouch. "Dolores," I said gently, "you should give it to him. And you should be the one to tell him what happened. He dislikes me. He wouldn't accept it from me." Dolores nodded, blinking away her tears. "Master Edward," Lee said softly, "do you know why? Why Allison did this? It seems so unlike her." I shook my head. "I don't know. Lord Gabriel believes she had a sickness, imbalance of the humors that poisoned her brain and drove her to madness, and it was probably brought on by the death of her father. I don't know." Sadie, who had been unusually silent up to this point, burst out with, "Her father? A fine way she has to honor her father, wicked, selfish gal. After all her father did for her, to repay him so." Quivering with righteous fury, she heaved herself up from her chair and stormed, still barefooted, into her kitchen. "Dick," we heard her bellowing, "Dick, get your bony carcass up off that cot and get to work. This floor is filthy. You think I feed you so you can lie around and sleep all day?" Dolores took Lee home. I spent the rest of the day and all of the next brewing potions, seeing clients, and trying not to think about poor miserable Allison Tanner, who would still be alive if only she'd had the faith to confide her pain in one of her household. The next day after that was God's Day. Somehow my mother had extracted a promise from Sadie that on the next God's Day I would accompany her to the prayer service at the chapel of St. Gabriel down the street from Grandfather's. I didn't recall being consulted about this promise, so I assumed it had been arranged on the day of the great fish orgy while I was out looking for Allison's ring. As I stood wondering what I could wear, it dawned on me that the poor girl's funeral had taken place on a God's Day exactly a week before. My penance was over, no more ratty clothes, and black bread. Sadie had thoughtfully cleaned my favorite coat. I slipped into it and began arranging the folds of fabric. I whistled as I went downstairs. "Good morning, Sadie," I said, beaming at her. "Thank you so much for washing my clothes." I hugged her. "You're welcome, love," she said, giving me a squeeze in return. "Are you going to go see your mother this morning, dear?" "In a while," I said. "I thought before I left I might have a bit of breakfast." Some considerable time later, I made my leisurely way up to my mother's home, humming to myself, Sadie was right, I reflected. Thinness is definitely overrated. Mother greeted me with her customary squeal of, "Aw, Eddie, dearest," and a warm embrace. She offered me breakfast, and since I had a brisk long walk from the Snake and Egg to my parents' home, I accepted. I dozed off in the warmth of the chapel as I sat leaning against the back wall, and I dreamt of Allison again. This time, she wasn't throwing rocks. She was throwing dead fish from the beach, and she was throwing them at Malcolm. Unlike in all my other dreams, she wasn't just sobbing, she was shouting. "I hate you," she cried and hurled a fish at her lover. "I hate you." I must have made some sort of noise in my sleep, because at that point, Mother woke me with an elbow jab to the ribs. "Eddie," she hissed, "pay attention." She glared at me, as only a mother can glare, and shook her head. "You oughtn't eat so much breakfast," she whispered, "if it's going to put you to sleep. You're as bad as your father." Just then my father let out a snore that turned heads for 6 rows in all directions and drew a glare from the priest. Father Gerald kept droning on till mid-afternoon. I managed to stay awake for the rest of the service. Barely. Father kept snoring. I suppose Mother didn't try to wake him because she knew what a futile gesture it would be. Once the service ended, Mother informed us that Grandfather was expecting our presence at a meal. That woke Father up. As we walked out of the chapel together, Father turned to me and said, "I hear you found out what really happened to that Tanner girl. Terrible shame, terrible mess." I nodded. Yes, it was. Who told you?" "Oh, one of the apprentices." He shrugged. "News travels fast in the city, bad news even faster." "But I also heard," he said with a sly grin, "that a certain kinsman of mine was seen visiting the castle and visiting the prison on king's business with His Majesty's royal wizard. And it wasn't my ass-sharking nephew either. I'm proud of you, son. I told you you'd be somebody someday." I didn't mention that he had originally opposed my becoming a wizard. "Father," I said, "I'm happy for your sake if folks are saying good things about me, but I promise I didn't go to the castle to curry favor with the nobles. I went to prove that Dennis Cobbler was innocent of murder so he could go home to his wife and his child." "Well, of course you did, son. I know that," Father said. "I really wish none of this had even happened," I said. "We all do, Eddie. I hear Allison Tanner was a beautiful girl. Still, now that it's all over, you can stop worrying about her." "That's my problem," I said. "I can't. I keep feeling like, I don't know, there's something more I need to do so she can rest. I had a few dreams about her before the trial, and just now I had another one." "When just now?" Father asked. "You mean in chapel?" "Yes, I'm afraid I dozed off," I admitted sheepishly. "That's nothing to be ashamed of. Brother Gerald will run out of air before he runs out of things to preach on." Mother, who had been walking a modest pace behind us, came forward. "Eddie, did you say you've been dreaming? Was it that sort of dream?" My childhood visions were still a topic of great interest in my parents' neighborhood. I don't know, Mother. I can't really tell if a dream means something or not until something happens." "But, Eddie, you say you've dreamt of her more than once," she said. "Surely that means it's important." "Not necessarily. I had often had dreams of being naked in public. but so far they had mercifully not come to pass. "You know, Winnie," Father said, "I think the boy shouldn't keep mucking about in these people's problems. It's over. The girl took her own life. She's dead. She's buried. It's not Eddie's problem anymore. Remember what my father used to say? The more you stir a shit, the worse it stinks." Trust my father to come up with those words of wisdom. Further conversation was ended by my arrival at grandfather's. My uncle and aunt were there. I was pleased to see Damien wasn't. After the meal, I decided to walk over to Leathered Lane. Not to muck about. I wanted to see how Dolores and Lee was faring. Besides, I figured I needed the exercise. Dolores was alone in the house. Where are the others? I asked, after returning her hug. "Gone to the graveyard to lay flowers for Allison," she said. "Both of them?" I hadn't thought Lee particularly enjoyed Malcolm's company. "Oh, yes. Well, they've been gone all day. Probably went to chapel, too. The little one's quite keen on learning true religion, since you started teaching her, Master Edward." I'm not sure Lee would have put it quite that way, but "She's been going to prayers with me too, Master. Can I get you anything? Something to eat or drink, maybe?" "Oh, no, thank you." "Well, sit down and just have a drink with me then," she said, "and we'll wait for Malcolm and Lee to come home." I agreed, and I joined her in the kitchen, sitting down at the table and sipping at the beer she poured for me. "So Malcolm's going to chapel in the graveyard," I said. "How is he doing these days, if you don't mind my asking?" "Better today, I suppose," Dolores said. "You know, when we came back from Sadie's the other morning, he wasn't here." "Where was he?" "Probably out drinking," Dolores said. She sighed. "He didn't come home until last night, and he looked absolutely awful." "Did you tell him about Allison?" "Yes, I did," she said. "And I gave him her ring." "How did he take the news?" "I suppose it helped him to know the truth." "Did he say anything?" I wasn't even sure why I'd asked, as it really wasn't my business anymore. "Not much. He just looked at her ring and said, 'Oh, so that's what they say happened.' Then he took the ring and went upstairs to bed. He's been sleeping in Master Roger's old room last few days, when he's been home. I think a decent night's sleep helped him. When he came down this morning, he asked Lee to come with him to visit Allison's grave, so I suppose he's finally accepted that she's gone." "If I were him," I said softly, "I'm not sure I could ever accept it. Not completely." We sat for a few minutes in silence. "This place isn't a home anymore," Dolores said. "I'm thinking of leaving if Malcolm will let me. Sadie's offered me a place, or I have a couple of sons, living with their families way south in Portsmouth. I suppose I could find somebody willing to take me to them." She paused and looked around the whitewashed kitchen. "I've been here since Master Roger's wife died, but I just don't see as I can stay any more. It's like this house has a curse or something. Do you know it's been so hot lately? All the fish in the pool up and died, and I don't even know what happened to the poor duck." "What?" I said. What's wrong with the duck?" "Why, it's died too," she said. "I told you, it was sick, and now this morning I went out and I found it stark dead floating in the fish pond." I began to have an odd feeling in the pit of my stomach, and it didn't have anything to do with anything I'd eaten. Dolores, I said, could you show me to the fish pool? Many well-to-do craftsmen's families in Belcamp still raise some of their own food as delicacies for special occasions. My sister Deborah raised geese and the occasional pig. My mother kept chickens for their eggs and a pond of fish as well. Pond-raised fish, she said, were fresher and of a better flavor than what she could get at market. The tanner's pond was very like my mother's, a half barrel filled with water, about 3 feet deep and 4 feet across, just big enough to raise half a dozen fish to table size. It seemed empty, except for a few white feathers floating on its surface. You don't think there's something wrong with the water? Dolores asked. I don't know, I said. Do you have a net to clean the pond with? Yes, I've been cleaning it, she said. I mean, there's only so clean I can get it. The bottom's lined with pebbles. I see, I said. Could you please bring me the net? When Dolores went into the kitchen for the net, I considered the position of the pond relative to the rest of the house. It was up against the kitchen wall. My eye traveled up the sloping tiled roof of the kitchen and then to the bedroom wall. One pane of the window was still broken. It occurred to me that if Malcolm had put his hand through that window glass as he had said in court, he would have probably thought twice about punching me all the times that he did. Here you go, Dolores said, returning with the net. I started scooping up clumps of gravel from the bottom of the pond and dumping them out onto the ground. Be careful, she said. I know there's glass from the window in there. I nodded. May I ask what you're hoping to find, Master Edward? Hopefully nothing, I said, poking gingerly at the gravel with my finger. But I'm afraid I'm going to find the answer to the nightmares I've been having. Nightmares? I didn't answer Dolores, continuing to shovel out little mounds of pebbles. One heap contained a different sort of stone. It was a bit smaller than a hen's egg, dark gray, with a metallic sheen to its nubbled surface. Unwisely, I touched it. Ouch! What's wrong? Dolores asked, kneeling beside me. What's wrong? I thought, looking at my blistered fingers' tips. I remembered the scars on Allison's dead hand. What's wrong indeed? Dolores reached for the gray stone. No, don't touch it! I cried. Why? What is it, Master Edward? It's what I should have been looking for all along. One more chapter.